My name is Andrew Stotz, and I'll be your host as we continue our journey into the teachings of Dr. W. Edwards Deming. Today, we're talking about the Langford application of Deming to bring joy in learning. David Langford has devoted his life to applying Dr. Deming's philosophy to help students and teachers get the most out of learning. David, how are you doing?
Great to be back again.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to talk about this topic, which is, how should teachers track progress in education? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that topic.
Well, we were talking in earlier podcasts about joy in learning, and just as an aim or direction that you want to proceed, that's great. But teachers in classrooms also have a responsibility to actually accomplish something. And we're not talking about every day while we're just playing games and we have a lot of joy going on. And the greatest joy in learning in a classroom is accomplishment. That feeling that you actually did something and learned something to a higher level, that's greater than any kind of game or trick or gadget or something that you could employ in a classroom. So when I started actually thinking about this after going to Deming seminars and looking at my classrooms, and while I couldn't just stop grading because we had a whole grading system set up at A, B, C, D, and F, and a GPA system that depended on it and all kinds of things, I had to start thinking about if the grading system is taking away joy in learning, then how could I work within a system to optimize my classroom? And if the bigger school never caught on, then so be it. But I could make a difference for these kids and this time. So I remember the first thing that I did was I went to my principal and I said, is there any rule or barrier that says that all of my students can't get A's? And he looked at me strangely and laughed.
Nobody ever asked me that.
No, they could all get A's. That's possible. And so that was the first barrier, because in my mind, I thought I had to artificially stratify the data, because if I had too many A's, I'd get in trouble. And in many schools, that's still what happens. And universities as well. If you got too many students getting A's, people say, well, you're dumbing down the system, or you're an easy grader, or an easy teacher, or there's all kinds of ways that we keep people in line and get them to go back to the old system by, saying those kinds of things. So when I started asking my students, what would it take for all of us to get A's in the class? What would we have to do? How would we have to operate? And because none of my training to that point had ever taught me how to do that. In fact, taught me to do the opposite. In fact, when we got computer technology, it was so great because I taught all the teachers how to grade students to 1/1000th of a point. That would really make sure we don't have too many A's, right? And we've gotten away from things like when I was growing up, teachers used to put lists in the classrooms. Like if you took a test, and that'd be a list with your name and your score and ranked from highest to lowest, and you could just see the pain on kids' faces when they go up and look at the list and realize how far down the list they were.
Name and shame
process. Yeah, shame that goes along with that.
By the way, what does it mean? What would it mean if you were successful to the extent that your whole class got A's? What would that mean? What would be the outcome for the students or for the school?
Well, again, Deming talked about optimization of a system. And so if you think about just a classroom, for instance, to me, it would mean that 100% of the students are achieving 100% of what you want them to do 100% of the time. I mean, that would be the optimum system. And you'd probably say, well, that person would be teacher of the year, but they probably wouldn't, because too many of their students would be doing well. And we tend to
And
not like that. So,
and how would you respond if somebody says, "Oh, yeah, like you said, dumbing down." Okay, yeah, it just shows that you need to make the material tougher.
yeah, anybody could do that. I mean, you can just keep on making things tougher and tougher and more complex and grading harder until nobody's achieving. And then what a wonderful teacher you are, right? Look at what a tough teacher I am. Nobody in my class got an A. Well, when given the chance, people will self-select themselves out of those systems. I'm not going to voluntarily go sign up for a teacher like that, knowing that they don't give any A's.
Right.
Right.
You kind of think, what's the point of going into this class?
Right. And what I'm describing now is that how you can begin to work within a system like this to change it. But ultimately, there has to be a whole different kind of a system set up.
So if we go
to
back,
monitor progress.
If we go back to this, the topic, when we started, is how should teachers track progress in education? And I think you've already, highlighted something that I would love to go into a little bit more detail. Is the purpose of education for a teacher to establish what they want the students to gain from their class and then assure that they gain that? Is that the goal? Or actually, I really don't know.
Well, there's some amazing things that happen that when you go to a class or a university or whatever, is you find out that people don't know what they don't know. Right. So by what method are they going to know what they don't know?
Mm.
So we have things like course syllabuses and things like that, but that doesn't really give a student an indication of what they need to know and understand. And if you already know everything that's being taught in a class, why are you even in the class? It's really just a waste of your time and everybody else's time, except we play these games because that's an easy way to get a good grade and my GPA goes up, because I don't really need this class because I already know everything. So that's what led me to create what I call a capacity matrix, which in any given area, what are the capacities that you need to know and understand? And that's based on neuroscience, again, that we learn things from concept to detail. So if I'm beginning a unit or whatever you want to call it, a chapter, or whatever it might be, I want to outline for students exactly what it is they need to know. And I want to put that in the form of the aim of what you're trying to accomplish, again, based on Deming. Then what are the basic concepts that I need to understand within that? And then at this level, what are some of the details, the really important details that I basically want you to remember forever from going through this class, whether we're talking about a geometry class or we're talking about a history class or whatever it might be. What are those details? Because if you think of something like like the American Civil War. I've been in Australia and lots of other countries, and they teach about the American Civil War, right? Well, how many details could somebody know about the American Civil War? Infinite, right?
Mm. Yep.
And it used to be that when I was growing up, and probably you too, that somebody that was really smart, they said, "Oh, he's really smart." Well, he or she could probably recall a lot of facts about things instantly, whatever subject that was. Somebody who's really smart in science or math or whatever it might be, they could recall stuff. Well, now we have the internet, and in 30 seconds or less, I can pull up any answer I want to on anything around the world.
Right.
And so what's really smart now?
Well, one of the things about the Civil War, if I think about the Battle of Shiloh, and I think about how the Southern troops were destroying the Union troops in the first day. And Grant arrived late on the scene. It was a very rough day. At the end of that day, General Sherman came up to him and said, "It's the devil's own day." And Grant said, "We'll lick him in the morning."
So what you're identifying, you're also starting to identify what are the major concepts that you would want students to know about that Battle of Shiloh. And what's the overall aim? How the Battle of Shiloh in the Civil War has affected your family's future. Oh, that's going to cause a student to sit back and think, what? I mean, learning this today has affected where I live and my family. And well, I'm going to look at that battle totally different than just memorizing a bunch of facts like, well, how many people were killed on the first day, and this happened and that and the other thing. And now you're starting to say, okay, maybe we have, if our aim is to understand that battle, then what are the major concepts within that? And now you're talking about Grant and Lee, and
well, also what do you do when a lesson about how do you handle adversity and how he handled adversity, and that. But I can just visualize that.
So
story.
that may be the major concept that you want to get across is, how do you handle adversity? See, so through the Battle of Shiloh, I'm tying it directly to something very personal to me, myself, and my family. And then secondly, the big concept I want is handling adversity. And then under handling adversity, what would be the major facts that you'd want to know?
Yeah, like how badly was he beaten on that first day? Was his lines pushed back? Also, why did he have such confidence? Well, there were reinforcements that were marching all night to arrive in the morning.
So under handling adversity, there's maybe 5 major facts that I'd really want people to know and remember basically forever.
Right.
Well, the capacity matrix that I made gets people to think about that. And then basically you start to test yourself, because the first stage is you have to say, do I have information on this? So adversity, the Battle of Shiloh, I know nothing about that. Okay, well, you're at a good place, right? You're in the right class, because you're going to learn a lot about that, right? And that's going to excite me, because now I need to know what I have to do. And then second stage is, do I have knowledge about this? Could I explain this to somebody else? How the adversity at the Battle of Shiloh has affected my family's culture. Wow. See, so I have knowledge of that. And then the third stage is application. Can I do something with this? Can I apply this? And then the fourth stage is wisdom. So wisdom, I often say, comes from a lot of bad experience, but it comes from a lot of good experience too. But basically in the human brain, the way you gain wisdom is being able to take things from one area and transfer it to another. So when I take adversity that I've learned from the Battle of Shiloh and the concept and the things I learned about handling adversity, and now I'm applying that because I'm also on the basketball team. And all of a sudden my brain is taking those concepts and applying that, and I'm sharing it with the other kids on my team about how to handle adversity from what I learned in that. Well, that's wisdom, because you're cementing that in the brain, in the deeper reaches of the brain. So when you start thinking about, I have to test them. I have to have some points or something, right, to put in my grade book or mark something down. Well, if I have a capacity matrix that has all the capacities that you need to know and understand, and to what degree do you need to understand them, and then I give you some test, right? What's going to happen? Well, everybody's score is going to go up, right? Because you're not playing the game of school. I don't know how it was when you went to college, but I remember asking our college professors, is this going to be on the test? And they'd say something like, well, maybe, which always gave you a lot of confidence, right?
Yeah.
So you should really memorize these 5 million things just in case I pull out 10 of them.
Well, I also,
Was
I have another story that I'm thinking about. You know, you talked about aim, you talked about concept, you had details. And I was thinking that, you know, the story of Grant and Sherman and Shiloh, that the story of Grant and Sherman's communication is a tool for remembering and for understanding. The other thing I was thinking about is the other day I was looking at the balance sheet of a company for my work, and the balance sheet was split 50-50. 50% of the balance sheet was cash and 50% was long-term assets. Okay? And I could see that the balance sheet, I'm simplifying it a bit, but I could see that the total profit that this balance sheet, you know, earned was 10% profit for this 100 of assets. And then I wondered, okay, so what would be the amount that would be earned on just the long-term assets? And I said, well, if 50% is cash, then I would need to multiply 50% times the amount of earnings that you would get on cash. And then I would say plus the 50% that's long-term assets times X. Now I know that cash earns 0. So 0.5 times 0 is 0. And therefore, I can see that the remaining, that I'm actually, the company is earning, actually, that 10% is being all earned on half of the balance sheet. And this was algebra. And I remember how to calculate that, and I wrote that down yesterday. And I underlined each section, and I broke the formula down until I could solve for this calculation. And it reminded me of the teacher I had in algebra, that he kind of forced us, you know, I mean, you had to underline each step in the algebraic process in order to get full points from him. And now, at that time, it was just pedantic. But now I see that, oh, wow, it structured the way that I could break down and apply this particular learning. I'm curious,
so,
when you think about
so a
tracking
whole
the
bunch of,
progress in education, what does this mean?
so a whole bunch of people just heard you tell that story and they said, what?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? But I also was observing as you're talking about it, you had a big smile on your face because there was a lot of joy in your discovery, and you having to think through that you weren't getting a grade for it. Well, some people might say, well, yeah, if you make a profit, your company, you're making more money, and so that's your grade. I suppose that's one way you might think about it. But you were getting a lot more joy in solving the problem and thinking it through. And then the wisdom part of it was that you thought, hey, yeah, I learned that in algebra, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the human brain, we all have cells in our brains that called the meaning network. And so the more you tap into the meaning network with people, the greater the chance they are that short-term memory is going to go into what's called long-term potentiation and the more permanent structures in the brain. So something happened when you were learning that algebra years and years and years ago that moved it into that permanent structure in your brain. Now, whether that was the underlining strategy or whatever it was, you remembered it. And if you'd never touched it again, that algebraic concepts, et cetera, your brain probably would have gotten rid of that thinking. But because in your business and what you've done, you've actually reinforced that over a long time, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you can recall that in an instant, you know, thinking about it. Well, this is what we want students to be able to do in anything that they go through. And the more we can tie that to either something current that's happening to them now, their meaning network, or something in the future. For instance, if I ask students, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? The sad thing is, a lot of times in high schools, I've asked kids that, and they look at you just totally blankly. Like, what are you talking about? Whereas, you know, I remember thinking about in second grade what I wanted to be doing and thinking about. But the more we ask students that, and we find out that, oh, well, Susie wants to be a nurse, and And right now, Billy wants to be a firefighter, and somebody else wants to go into the Army. But the more I know that, and I know what is your meaning network, and if I talk to the young Andrew in that algebra class, I said, "What do you want to do?" And you said, "Someday I want to own my own company."
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I could have really tapped into that. Everything about algebra would have been tied to owning a company and getting you to think about that. And if I'm reinforcing that with you, it's like my daughter wanting to write a book, right? Same kind of thing. If I'm reinforcing that with you, I've got 30 other students that are listening to me reinforce that with you. And somebody else says, "Hey, I want to do that too," right? So it's not like we have to tailor make it to every single student. You're actually teaching the concept of future thinking and critical thinking, and how you're going to tie this through. It's interesting you bring out the math concept, because I've asked math teachers sometimes, why do you need to know this? Why do you need to know the Pythagorean theorem? And
because it's on the test.
Have an answer either, other than to get an A on the test.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is definitely not joy in learning.
No. Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, most of that practice, the human brain tries to get rid of that learning as fast as possible to make room for more new useless learning in order to pass a test. Yeah. Right. And this cycle just goes on and on and on and on, and then you start throwing more and more weight on it. Wow, if you don't do well in this test, you're not going to get a high GPA. And if you don't have a high GPA, you can't get into a college. And if you don't go to college, you're not going to make a good salary. And right. And the joy just keeps being squashed over and over and over. And so people just learn to just do whatever they have to do to survive. And
so to wrap this up, how to bring it to the conclusion, how should teachers track progress in education? What do you want people to remember from this discussion?
Yeah, so now you're starting to talk about the characteristics of quality, and that's probably a whole nother podcast about how to go about that. But you have to start thinking about, if I want joy in learning, and what are the characteristics that I would most want to monitor or think about. And I started out with about 12 that I had listed out, and realized there's no way I could track all of those and come up with systems to be able to do that. And over the years, just finally just narrowed it down to two things: that I wanted high quality work. So everybody that's attempting to do something is achieving at a very high level. And then secondly, there's a time factor. So right now, teachers manage the time schedule, right? You have this done in 3 days, and that's the deadline. And it even has the word dead in it. If you don't have this done by Friday, you're going to be dead. And we use that fear to get people to do things that we think that they don't want to do. So we can probably explore more about how do you track quality and time and create joy in learning at the same time.
I remember learning about where the word deadline came from. And it came from battles, Civil War and other wars, where the rifles that they had would only shoot so far, and they only had one type of rifle. And they would always line up in opposing lines, and armies would face each other off in opposing lines. And therefore, the approaching army would know where was the point where the bullets could kill them, and the step just back a little bit, and then the bullets couldn't reach them, and that was the deadline.
Exactly the same thing in education.
Well, on behalf of everybody at the Deming Institute, I'd like to thank you all for joining our discussion of the Langford application of Deming to bringing joy in learning. Thank you, David, for another fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Andrew.